involved with the museum for so many years. We really appreciate your support and your being part of the museum. I especially hope that you got to check out our exhibitions. Today is the last day of At First Light, which is our collaboration with visual communications, and a lot of the content in that exhibition does relate really directly to what we're talking about today, and there's a lot of parts of NCRR that are in that exhibition, so I hope you check that out before it closes. We will be selling the book in the lobby that we'll be talking about today, as well as some other items from different community organizations, so please just stay around afterwards for a reception. And then finally, I just want to acknowledge that we are in the Takuuchi Democracy Forum that's part of the Japanese American National Museum, which is on what is still Tonga land, so acknowledging that this is occupied Tonga land, and that we are also within Little Tokyo, which is a 135-year-old historic Japanese American community. So really just want to acknowledge that that is the space that we're in, and I'm really excited that this program is here because I think that it really deals with all these issues of community and space and organizing. So thank you so much for coming again, and enjoy the program.
The catalyst for this idea was the June 2018 launch of the book NCRR, the Grassroots Struggle for Japanese American Redress and Reparations, of which Miya has been a longtime NCRR member. The fruits of her labor and working many long hours over the past year is finally realized today. So thank you, Miya. Please enjoy the program.
Oh, hi. My name is Jim Matsuoka, and I want to welcome you all to a discussion on activism. There is a strong link between dissent and activism. And when activism is based on dissent, at some point in time, it will strike out for justice. In the article I wrote for the NCRR book on grassroots struggle, I noted that we, the Japanese American community, we were waiting for justice to find its time. After the war, we were living in a hard time. We were a destroyed community, stripped of all of our assets and reduced to what we could carry in our two hands. And when asked at the first of the modern-day pilgrimages in 1969, how many people are buried in the cemetery in Manzanar, I replied, a whole generation. Ethnic cleansing would not be an extravagant use of words to describe the state of being of the once prosperous Japanese communities of California and the West Coast. We were a beaten down and despised people, stripped of all we had worked for. My father's life savings and all he had were wiped off the books at Sumitomo Bank as enemy alien assets. My father never found work again, only as an occasional dishwasher. My sisters luckily found jobs as nurses' aides, making beds and emptying bedpans to keep my parents and me from starving. But I remember the time I had to speak up for my parents to tell the rent collectors that we couldn't make the rent for the shabby old trailer we were living in at Long Beach. I spent my childhood in Manzanar. I was a child filled with self-hate. I could only reproach myself for looking like the hated enemy. I can easily relate to what the kids at the border are going through. I was too young to strike out for justice, too young to fight back in dissent, to show how we hated the hypocrisy of what was happening to us in the camps. But others did not. They rioted at Manzanar, they went on strike at Poston, they refused induction into the Army at Heart Mountain, Minidoka, and Poston, and refused to answer questions and wound up at Tula Lake with thousands of others who were prepared to renounce their citizenship. From the dissent, from the hypocrisy of the government, from the shredding of all our rights, from the destruction of our communities, and from the overt racism of the public and the racism of our mayors, governors, and even our president and the Supreme Court, the seeds of our activism was born. There is a strong link between activism and dissent, and when that activism is based on dissent, at some point in time, it needs to strike out for justice. Thank you.
We got formed in 1980, and most of us were sansei who had a passionate anger in learning what went on during World War II about our beaten down community of Japanese Americans. And so that was the beginning point for many of us, and we joined with Nisei to form NCRR because we really felt that the grassroots, regular everyday people, were key to really building this movement. And what redress is really all about, what happened to the Japanese American community as a whole. And so one of the first things that we worked on, what we wanted to do was to pick up that beaten down community, to talk to them, to give them confidence, to be able to talk about their stories, what happened during World War II, and to begin to think about speaking out. And so in 1981, there was a watershed moment when there was a commission, a federal commission called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, which held hearings throughout the country. And the first hearings were here in Los Angeles in August of 1981. And it was a very powerful, raucous set of hearings. And we want to give you a taste of those hearings in this clip right now.
My wife, a U.S. citizen, and her family were evacuated to Arkansas via Santa Anita racetrack. They received a telegram while in Arkansas, supposedly from Japan, that her family was being called back to Japan during the war, and the American government had no other choice but to send them back. Upon reaching there, to their surprise, they discovered that Japan had not sent this telegram. It was later discovered that there were one family which was exchanged for the return of another family to the United States. Her father was killed by the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. Her mother and family were 20 miles away from the bomb site. I am led to believe that this is not an isolated case, and it is certainly an area that this commission should investigate.
Dr. Fleming, forgive my emotional outburst, but what you just said to me touched me so deeply. It sort of erased these 39 years of pain I've been feeling. 39 years of pain we've been feeling. And what happened in 1942. And I want you to know I appreciate those thoughts. All this bitterness that I've been holding inside of me has been coming out little by little. But I think with your speech tonight, I think it'll be gone forever. I just want to thank you for that. I wish it would be recorded somewhere. I'll read it over and over again, and I'll show it to my children. Because they were the ones who asked me about camp, I sort of kept it from them. And when they asked me why, and they asked me, why did I go to camp without protesting? And why did I behave the way I did? I didn't have any answer for them. And as the years go by, I understand. It was my cultural heritage. It was the fact that I was Japanese as well as American. And because of this evacuation, I really denied my children their Japanese heritage. I wanted to erase that part. I wanted to be 100% American and be accepted. But anyway, as I get older, I realize that I was wrong. And I just appreciate what you just said, and I'll remember the things you said for the rest of my life. Thank you.
Thank you.
The 44th has never said anything of such to anyone.
No, wait. I'm sorry. Listen,
I'm sorry.
if we have outbursts like this, we're going to ask people to be removed.
We know how some people are.
Now, wait a second. There
I,
are some.
Wish we could show you more, but right now we're gonna go ahead and have the panelists from our first part come on up. And our first speaker is Miya Iwataki. Miya was the legislative chair of NCR during that time, and she also worked in the office of Congressman Mervyn Dimely. And so she's going to answer these questions of how did the commission hearings impact the trajectory of the campaign for redress and reparations, and what was its lasting legacy? What was NCR's role within it? And how did NCR work with Congressman Dimely during that time?
Thank you, Richard. Hello? Thank you, Richard. So I have 5 minutes, so this is going to be the Cliff Notes version. So as you saw from the video, after 40 years of silence and gaman, the Japanese American people stood up and spoke out. And so today, it's hard to imagine that redress and reparations was really controversial. In fact, NCRR had to develop a survey, which the Ralph Sheepmo ran, to see what the majority of the people in the community were feeling. Well, 95% of the 4,000 respondents supported redress, 89% favored payments of $25,000 per individual, and the people spoke. So NCRR was doing a lot of outreach at that time, bringing the issue of redress to the community. Around that time, we met Congressman Mervyn Dimely. I went to a Matsuoka town hall meeting in Gardena where Dimely was the guest speaker. And we raised the issue of redress. He was immediately on board. He met with the NCRR steering committee at JACCC. He agreed to introduce legislation. Our attorney, Gerald Sato, drafted a bill. Merv came over to my parents' house where the CC was having a breakfast meeting, rolled up his shirt sleeves, went through every line of legislation, and finalized it, and his office introduced HR 7384. So working for Merv was really a great opportunity, and he was a staunch supporter and brought the Congressional Black Caucus, which he chaired, along for every step of the way during the redress struggle. A little later, NCRR took a short trip, our first trip to Washington, D.C. It was a small delegation of about 6 to 8 people, made up of people from Northern California and Southern California, Nisei 442nd veterans, and Merv got us situated at different congressional staffers' homes for the time that we were there. We met, for the first time, Norm Mineta, Bob Matsui, Spark Matsunaga, and Dan Inoue. And on that trip, Congressman Dimely hosted a reception for NCRR and JACL in the Rayburn building, and about 125 legislators and staff showed up. And that was our first taste of Washington, D.C., and we were in. Well, in 1982, legislation to establish a presidential commission on wartime relocation and internment of civilians was introduced to study whether or not, basically, an injustice had been committed when the Japanese were put into concentration camps. And it, of course, beat out the 2 bills that were calling for direct monetary restitution. And we were really concerned because the Issei were already well into their 80s and 90s, and this would prolong the process. 2 minutes. NCRR heavily lobbied the commissioners. We wanted to see a hearing in every major city that had a significant Japanese American population. And as a result of NCRR advocacy, the Commission held 20 days of hearings in 8 cities during July to December 1981. Over 750 people testified. In LA, we had 3 days of hearing plus 1 evening to accommodate working people. In LA, 160 people testified. However, getting the Issei and the Nisei to testify was really a challenge. Most Nisei had not ever talked to even their families about camps. And there were language issues for Issei, memory issues, reluctance to speak publicly, especially with personal information. And that's why we have to hand it to people like Martha Okamoto, who testified about her brother that was shot and killed by a guard at Manzanar. Her children learned about this as she testified. We did everything possible to work with the community and help them to prepare. We had house meetings, help them write testimonies. We provided buses for transportation for people in outlying cities, and the people came out. The state building was not prepared and had to even open up an extra room. We had interpreters and interpretive headphones. We had press conferences every day after the hearings to keep the community appraised and to keep the issue in front of the American people. The strong response to the commission hearings galvanized our community, brought national attention, and put a human face on redress and reparations. Okay. I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of good stuff that Congressman Dimely did during the delegation and just say that in 1983, the commission published Personal Justice Denied. Their findings found no military necessity, and that the decision to put people in camp was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a lack of political leadership. And I just want to end saying how fortunate we were. How many communities have had the opportunity to have such a meaningful and powerful and unifying experience shared with our entire community. Thank you.
So the commission hearings were in 1981. Also in 1981, NCRR first started organizing an annual program to commemorate the signing of Executive Order 9066, which was signed on February 19th, 1942 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so every year since then, we have this annual program. It's called the Day of Remembrance, or DOR, where we want to commemorate that day, to remember what happened to our community, and to remember those who passed away since that time. Also, we want to bring the lessons from that incarceration to today's challenges, what's going on in the political climate of today's world. And so each year, we have a poster and now a postcard which depicts the theme of that program each year. And we really want to kind of get the message out to the community that this is what's going to be, we're going to try to talk about at this Day of Remembrance program. And so David Monkawa, who's a very talented, gifted community artist, has done maybe half of the DOR posters since 1981. So David is going to talk about what he was trying to present in his artwork, and also he's going to talk briefly about 2 campaigns that NCR did in the 80s and 90s.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to talk about 3 things here in 5 minutes. You're going to have to, I'm going to go really fast, so no offense, everybody. Hi, how are all of you? I can't see your faces. I know King and Diane's here, Tracy, I can see you. So we have friends out here, so that's cool. Thank you. My name's David, and I used to be co-chair with June Keys. You saw her up there in the early 90s for NCRR. And when priorities permit, I used to do posters as well. So I'll talk about the artwork. And I know Richard told me, so what makes you do artwork the way you do it for, for a Day of Remembrance and stuff. So just stepping back a little bit, I used to do artwork when I was in high school. I used to do pictures of aggressive animals and, and naked white ladies and guns. I used to draw a lot of guns. And, it's kind of like prison tattoo theme, So then, when the Watts uprising happened, this really rich Madison Avenue guy named Bill Terra, he started to go all throughout the inner cities and selected a few kids from each high school and had this program called Tutor Art. And he would invite these really famous artists to come there. And one person that had a big impact on me was named Charles White. He's an African-American guy. He's called the father of black art, and they had a retrospective at the County Art Museum about him recently. But he was a civil rights activist and a socialist like his friends like Paul Robeson and A. Philip Randolph and people like that. So anyway, he never said anything about that kind of stuff, but he taught us. And one thing he did was that he made us not draw things from our minds, because I used to draw everything from my head, but he said, go out and draw your family and your neighborhood and your house, and that's all I want. So he forced us to do that. And we would come back and we had to display our pictures. So Marco Mendez, my friend, would have pictures of his mom making tortillas, and I had pictures of my mom making musubi. And then, somebody else had pictures of his mom, making chitlins and stuff. So, and then, people ironing clothes at the laundry, or going to the laundromat and washing clothes, and all these kind of pictures. So we started realizing that even though we're different nationalities, we have more in common than differences. That's how he tried to teach us. So that's one big one. The second really big influence was during the redevelopment right before. A good friend of mine's auntie was going to be moved out, Auntie Fumi. She used to live at one of the old hotels, the Matsuoka Hotel. And my friend made a kind of researching the redevelopment people, and he found that Robert Rowan and Stanley Grimstein owned Fram Carburetors, and Robert Rowan owned Rowan Real Estate. They were big players in redevelopment. But they were also the biggest donors to the LA County Art Museum. And they were big players in the LA art industry. And everybody knew that unless these guys were on your side, you're not going to go very far. So I didn't want to say anything at first, but I knew that I had to make a choice between do I want to work for these guys who's moving my friend's auntie out of Little Tokyo, along with a whole bunch of Japanese Americans, or do I want to work with my friend and everybody else who's trying to stop the evictions, So that's how I kind of got involved into doing artwork for Day of Remembrance posters and things of this sort. And as far as the Japs incident goes, later on, flash forward to about 1985, and after Reagan got in with the landslide, he was all into we can't have no entitlement programs, we have a big budget deficit. I don't know if you remember that. And certainly we're not going to give no money to no redress, So the budget deficit was a huge detriment to getting redress and stuff, so we were kind of in a lull. During that period, the trade wars were happening and anti-Asian violence was really skyrocketing, resulting in the death of Vincent Chin in 1982. So right after that, I was working at a phone company, and this guy phones in and says, I want Japs. And I said, excuse me? And so long story short, NCR demanded this hair salon to change its name, and they wouldn't. And so we went to West Hollywood City Council, and they wouldn't change it. They wouldn't force them to change it. They said it was like a First Amendment problem, So after that, we picketed them for about a year on Saturdays, which was the biggest. The people that were most consistent was Susie Katsuda, David, Richard Katsuda, people from the Marina JACL and others from NCR. And we, in UCLA Asian American Studies Center at that time, when they used to do those types of things, they were pretty active. So anyway, even to today, after 1 year, they changed their name, but by that time it was too late. So they basically voted. So even till today, in West Hollywood, some of the old-timers, they know that, if you use racial slurs like Japs publicly, the Japanese people, they'll shut you down. So that's a good thing for them to know that we'll shut them down. We've done it before, and we'll do it again. And thirdly, the final thing, to squeeze it in here, is Asian Valley Fountain Youth Alliance, which was a project of NCRR's. And this was in the early 90s. Japanese and Asian youth in Fountain Valley in Orange County, they're having their faces shot by police who stopped them, racial profiling. And these photographs, without permission, they were being entered into a national database for Asians, Asian gang, whatever. So we heard about it because Jason and Mark Kanchiga, these two Japanese American youngsters, they complained to the police and had lawsuits, and they told us about it. So what happened was that we protested at Fullerton City Hall and also at Fountain Valley City Hall. And the reason was that there was a lot of, I said that there was a lot of anti-Asian violence on the rise. Well, the skinhead white groups, the gangs were going up exponentially. They weren't being stopped. They were not being photographed Asian kids and black kids were. So anyway, I have to stop now. And so we did stop it, actually. They had to stop it because there's too many civil rights implications involved, so they did stop it. But it's a good example. These two previous struggles I mentioned, it's a good example of how we try to gather people for the lurch ahead in the later 80s, where we had to fight for redress.
Everything's at breakneck speed here, but if you will go back to the commission hearings, think about the recommendations of that commission were that because their findings were that the incarceration was because of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And they also recommended that Japanese Americans get reparations for $20,000 each. So this was in 1983 when the recommendations came out. And so from 1983 to 87, there was kind of a buildup of attempts at redress legislation. And in July of 1987, NCRR organized a very significant lobbying delegation to Washington, D.C. And our next speaker is Guy Aoki, who was one of the key organizers of that lobbying delegation, who's going to talk about why he joined NCRR and why the lobbying delegation was so important to him, how it had impact on his life and the other delegates. So, Guy Aoki.
Is mine a two-parter or is mine a one-parter? I'm confused. It's still a two-parter, right? Okay. No, I thought we were supposed to talk about why I joined NCRR. Well, first of all, I was born and raised in Hilo, Hawaii, and during World War II, 40% of Hawaii were Japanese Americans. So they couldn't intern everybody because then where would the economy go and who would run the state? So they concentrated on people who were leaders in the community. Luckily, my parents, their friends, were not that important, so they weren't locked up. But here's the weird thing about it. I mean, clearly Hawaii's closer to Japan than the West Coast is. But they interned everyone on the West Coast, and yet they were selective about who they interned in Hawaii. So somewhat for military necessity. I don't remember when I first knew about the camps, but I was always angry about it. I mean, I became a psychology major in college because I cared about the way issues impacted people's self-esteem. And I could only imagine how it impacted Japanese Americans for World War II. In the fall of 1981, Bert Nakano, who was the national spokesperson of NCRR, came to speak at my college, Occidental. And it was in a full auditorium. It was a mandatory attendance thing. It was part of, I think, American history class. And the commission hearings had just happened that past summer. So he showed some clips, and I was just riveted. I was just gutted by these things, like Miya said. I mean, the woman who said, I've never talked about this in front of my children, but my brother was shot in the back. And so afterwards, I talked to Bert, and I said, I'm also from Hawaii. So, well, you should join us. And I said, well, I'd love to, but I'm going back to Hawaii for college. So a year and a half later, I came back, and a year after that, in the fall of '84, who should come to speak to our Asian Alliance Club, but they were Monkawa. So, we talked afterwards, and he said, you forgot. We're all getting old. But he said, well, it sounds like you should join us. And I said, I think I should. So December '84, I came out, and I was active for over 8 years. I joined a lot of committees. I went to Sacramento to testify in front of the Department of Education. We wanted them to not endorse an internment video that was done by a white guy who we thought was not that great. And it was an honor working with Fred Korematsu, who also testified. And Fred was the kind of guy who, he didn't say a lot. So when he did speak, people really listened to him. So after I sat down from the podium, after I spoke, he took his pipe out of his mouth and he goes, great job. I felt like I was blessed by the Pope, Probably the most emotional event was co-emceeing with Keoji, this press conference in December of 1991. It was purposely done around the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. What we did was we reunited the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, which is a branch of the 442nd. We reunited them with a Polish woman they had saved when she was like 16 years old. Janina Sawinska. The Nazis had killed her parents. She was blindfolded. She was up against a firing squad. And any second, she expected the bullets to hit her. And then she heard a commotion, people yelling, and jeeps. And then someone took off her blindfold. And then he had a Japanese face. So she went, okay, go ahead and shoot. Now you Japanese are going to kill us. You know? But he says, no, I'm an American. We're here to rescue you. And so she told the press conference, I love Japanese people because they allow me to live and to dance. And she became a dance instructor in Northern California. So that was really emotional. But we did this to show that despite the way that we were treated, we served in the military, we saved countless lives. Towards the end of, I became chair of NCR's education committee, where we were trying to get what happened during camps into the high school textbooks. But I had to step down in February of '93 because I had formed Media Action Network for Asian Americans, or MANA, the previous April. It's the first Asian American media watchdog group. And things got overwhelming and I couldn't do both anymore, so I just stepped down. But over the years, NCRR has been very supportive of MANA. They've come to our press conferences, our protests, our awards dinners, and they're really great people. I remember at a day of remembrance, right after the first Gulf War, everyone talked about how we have to support our Arab American brothers and sisters. And Don Bastani, who had been my boss at American Dow 40 in Casey Kasem, he came up to me, he goes, I am so impressed with the Japanese American community. We have to get our act together. We have to be like you guys. So I just want you to know how much NCR has impacted so many communities, Arab Americans, and of course the Muslim Americans after 9/11. And it's been an honor to be on the panel with you guys and to see you guys again.
Okay, anyway, so 1987, NCR did this huge lobbying delegation, about 60 people from Southern California, 80 from the Bay Area and the rest of the country, all converged on Washington, D.C. to help with the redress legislation that was being discussed. And so the momentum was building in 1987 was the bicentennial of the Constitution. So it was very, very timely, and who knows how much that had bearing on their passing the HR 442 in the House and Senate Bill 2116 in the Senate. So they passed the bill in 1988. Finally, on August 10th of 1988, the bill became law, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, or CLA. And so the CLA provided reparations of $20,000 for those who were still alive on August 10th, 1988, or if they passed away after that date, to the heirs. And in addition, there was a presidential apology on behalf of the nation. And so after that, there was still a fight to get appropriations for CLA. And so Daniel Inouye was able to work out in Congress where this would become an entitlement rather than having to work for annual funding. And so the reparations checks and apologies started coming out October 1990. So that was great. First to the eldest and then to the other incarcerees. But then we soon heard that there were Japanese Americans being denied redress. And among those was the Japanese Latin Americans. I don't know if you've heard of their issue, but what happened was during World War II, 2,264 Japanese from Latin America were uprooted, essentially kidnapped from their homes, put on ships, and brought to Crystal City, Texas, to be incarcerated. And so the main reason they were brought in was many of them were used in a hostage exchange for white Americans who were caught behind enemy lines in Japan. And so many of them were involved in a hostage exchange. But when the war came to a close, they were left to fend on their own. And so one of the stipulations of the Civil Liberties Act was that you had to be a citizen or permanent resident of the United States during the war to be eligible for redress. And Japanese Latin Americans, or JLAs, had their papers, documents, official citizenship papers taken from them when they were brought to the United States, so they were denied redress. So NCRR formed a coalition with the ACLU of Southern California and JCL to form a group called Campaign for Justice for Japanese Latin Americans. And so we had all the negotiations with the Department of Justice, and finally we came out with a very bittersweet victory of $5,000 reparations for the JLAs. So as I said, that was very bittersweet. In addition, NCR worked on categories of redress denials for Japanese Americans. Among them, one was about the railroad workers and miners who were fired by the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific railroads during that time. And so they were first denied redress because the government said it was not because of government action. So we had to really dig to look for the smoking gun to show that government action was involved in this. And so there was a smoking gun uncovered in that showed this memo showing that there were FBI officials and other officials at meetings with the railroad companies to get rid of those workers. And so we in NCRR were able to win redress for the railroad workers and the miners. So in the 80s, we had the main redress movement. In the 90s, we had the redress denials campaign. And so after the 90s, NCR moved into kind of like stage 2 of 2000 and on. And Kathy Matsuoka is going to be talking about that part. So Kathy,